Welcome, everyone. We're just waiting for a few more people to come into our Zoom room, and we shall start our most exciting webinar in a few minutes. So let's just give each other and the new participants a bit more time to log in and get past any tech issues as we inevitably have in this digital world. So welcome to those who have just come in. And I hope you're all having a great morning, afternoon, evening, and for those of you who are really committed, middle of the night, welcome to our Zoom room. Okay, we're getting a bit crowded in the room, which is always great. Wow, this is it's a great crowd coming in. Okay, and welcome to those of you who are watching our live stream on Facebook. As with all PhilS4 webinars, we are recording this session so that those who may have missed the session, the live stream, will have an opportunity to watch at a later date. So welcome. Okay, so we might get started. My name is Sandra Sano-Alday from the University of Sydney. I represent the Sydney Southeast Asia Centre at the University of Sydney, and I'm zooming to you from the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, who are the traditional owners of the land on which the University of Sydney is built. Today we have a very exciting talk in our PhilS4 series, and we'd like to warmly welcome today Jorge Bayona. Jorge Bayona is a research professor of Southeast Asian Studies at the Centro de Estudios de Asia y África of El Colegio de Mexico. He earned his PhD in history at the University of Washington in Seattle in 2021, after which he was a postdoctoral fellow at the Asia Research Institute of the National University of Singapore. His research focuses on modern history of the Philippines and Southeast Asia. And without further ado, welcome, Jorge, over to you.
Thank you very much. I'm very pleased to be here. I would like to thank the organizers for inviting me. And so what I'm going to talk about is part of my dissertation, which has some gaps in the primary source research due to the COVID pandemic. So I welcome any and all feedback that you may have. I look forward to the Q&A part of this session. So what I am going to discuss here are these bouts of Moro Unrest in the southern Philippines during this specific period in the American colonial period, and how they relate to discussions about the Philippine Geobody, and how it was leveraged both to try to partition the country, to dismember the Philippine Geobody, or to suture the country together in the shape that it had during the Spanish colonial period, or at least the shape that the Spanish colonial authorities claimed to have given the colony. Now, so what I am going to try to argue in this presentation is that this context of unrest sheds light not only on Christian Filipino ambiguity towards Muslim Filipinos, but also anxieties of American imperial manipulation seeking to dismember the Filipino or the Philippine Geobody. Now, oh, sorry, that slide shouldn't have been there. But anyway, there is a general background. Perhaps I will go through this very quickly about the Muslim Filipino population in the island of Mindanao and the archipelago of Sulu, and also Palawan. That in general, as I mentioned previously, that the Spanish had claimed to have given shape to the Philippines, and yet in practical terms, they had not imposed complete control over the southern reaches of the archipelago. The Sultanate of Sulu, the Sultanate of Maguindanao, and various Muslim groups throughout the Lake Lanao region, and so on. The Lake Lanao region is a part that I will focus on specifically in this presentation. So it was only under American colonialism that these areas were effectively brought under the control of a territory in a way administered from Manila. And yet, after American conquest in the Moro American War in the late 19th century and early 20th century, they still set up a separate government for that region. This Moro province existed until 1914, and then it had this kind of transitional administration called the Department of Mindanao and Sulu. And it was only in the 1920s, in 1920, in fact, that it was finally transferred to the authority of Manila. Manila, of course, that was headed by an American colonial governor-general. Now, in this context in which we get a new governor-general, Governor-General Leonard Wood, a military officer, one who had served in the Moro American War, who was involved in some of the massacres pertaining to this war. So he had experience in the Philippines, who had a background as a surgeon, who had fought in the wars against the native populations of what is now the United States, had been passed over for a high-ranking position during World War I, had been passed over for nomination to run for president of the United States. But in this context, he presented this very strong, shall we say, reactionary position in Philippine politics. That is, in the years prior to the arrival of Leonard Wood, we had seen the process of Filipinization, of the devolution of much political authority to the Christian Filipino elite based out of mostly Manila. Leonard Wood would become one of the strongest adversaries of this process of Filipinization of the colonial bureaucracy, and of very short-term Filipino independence. He was against short-term Filipino independence, was much more of a retentionist, and any ideas of independence he foresaw as more of like a 100-year-long process. The opening salvo for General Wood, Governor-General Wood, in this situation pertaining to the Muslim population of the south of Mindanao came when he was appointed to co-head the Wood-Forbes mission of 1921. And it is already in this case, in the conclusions, he visited much of the country, including the southern provinces, the southern Muslim majority provinces. And this was a context of very contentious relationships with the Christian Filipino elites, who very quickly realized that he was going to push back on these policies of his predecessor. Among these confrontations was the situation of the Muslim population of the South. Even though it is clear from the reports that were in the newspapers at the time, in the press, that there was a very ambivalent position among Muslims regarding the future of their provinces within or without a Christian within or without a Philippines ruled from Manila. In his report, he stated that the Muslim population's position in this respect was unanimous, and they were against independence, and that if independence came to the Philippines, they wanted to remain a colony of the United States. And this, of course, set off a very contentious relationship between Governor-General Wood and the Christian Filipino elite. The Christian elite's response was quite ambivalent. They and this is something that we will see throughout this period. They would lambast those Muslims who stated this position, or sometimes they would just call for ignoring them altogether, of saying that they're a minority position, their position regarding independence is irrelevant due to their small numbers, and so on. It is very rare that in this early situation you see a very strong discourse of fraternity, even though it is there, and we will see how it develops over the course of this period. Now, there was this context of violence in the early to mid 1920s, these outbursts of violence in this context. Here we have a cartoon that emerged during one of these bouts of violence, and it's titled Kung Bakit ang Moro ay Mabangis na Naman, which is kind of like why the Moro is fierce again. And you can see this caricature of a Moro, of a Muslim juramentado, running amok in violence, killing figures who are presumably, due to their garb, Christian Filipinos. He has burnt the public school. There is a Filipino constabulary man approaching to put an end to the violence. But what you see on the left is the silhouette of Governor-General Wood, who is labeled Machiavello. There is this whole idea of him engaging in Machiavellian practices of trying to accomplish his aims of preventing Philippine independence or partitioning the country through underhanded means. And you see this in the context of the Datu Santiago Revolt in 1923. Datu Santiago was a former ally of Wood's. He was closely associated with Wood, and he started this revolt in the Lake Lanao region, and it did gain a lot of coverage from the press. It was surprising. There was this whole, and it all, of course, triggered all these discussions about like Muslim violence and so on. But it was also immediately a cause for suspicion on the part of the Christian Filipino elite, especially because very soon after the revolt was suppressed, Wood pardoned Datu Santiago. So it's just this suspicious kind of context for the Christian Filipino elite, something that they comment on in the press. A palette switch situation occurred 2 years later in another bout of unrest, the Lake Lanao region, in which instead of the military forces answering to the governor general immediately resorting to violence to put down another bout of Moro violence, they very conspicuously stood down, and they let those engaging in violence to run unchecked. And there were all these rumors in the press going like, what is happening? Why is this is unexplainable? And all these oblique references to the governor general, that the orders to stand down and not engage with those engaging in violence was coming from the governor general himself. And this led to the discourse of sinister forces at play. This idea that it was widely commented in the press that all of this was part of a Machiavellian plan to give a message to spread this discourse that Christian Filipinos who were now in charge of Mindanao and had been so since 1920 were failing at keeping Mindanao peaceful, that the violence was caused by their bad policies, by their autocratic impulses, and that Mindanao is becoming ungovernable. And they said that, and their suspicion was that this violence was actually being triggered by Leonard Wood himself. They found it suspicious that shortly after his visits to certain provinces, violence would break out later. So, and as the cartoon shows, you have this discourse happening, like occurring all over in the press. Something else that I find interesting is that this discourse often appears earlier in the Tagalog language press than in the English and Spanish language presses, which are languages that presumably would have been more surveilled by American authorities. Tagalog seemed to be more like they felt perhaps that they could get away with more. So all of this was seen as an attempt, and Governor General Wood referenced it numerous times over the course of these bouts of violence, that he was in context in which he was very clearly ambiguous about them, that he would smile about them, he would make comments about them, and he would often chalk these up to the old antagonism between Moros and Christians. this idea, he tried to leverage this violence as proof that there was no harmony possible between Filipino Christians and Filipino Muslims, that there was no such, that actually calling that, in a way, this idea of both of them being Filipinos is not, it's not practical, that there needs to be a partition between these two groups. And this was of course a discourse that was hotly contested by Christian Filipino commentators, who argued that actually both in the short term there was in the previous years prior to the arrival of Wood, numbers of violence had dropped precipitously, and it only spiked with the arrival of Wood, which is very suspicious in its sense. And also that actually there is a blood connection between Muslim and Christian Filipinos, that the only reason that there's conflict between them was because of Spanish influence in the past, and that actually there is a very strong civilizing mission impulse among Christian Filipinos, because they saw themselves as more advanced than Muslim Filipinos, and that it was their duty to go and civilize them. So this is also a complicated scenario, because in many ways it is a way they were trying to use Muslim Filipinos as a way of showing that they were among the civilizing peoples of the world, in a way similar to how the Siam used the Malay minority in the South and their policies towards them as a way of showing, of arguing we shouldn't be colonized because we too are civilizing backward people. So it is a very complicated discourse. And of course, much of the discourse was also about the hugely valuable natural resources available in Mindanao, and how it is this that independence without Mindanao would be a rump independence, because this Philippines made up of only Luzon and Visayas would be economically unviable. In my research, I have found very precious few comments of Christian Filipino elite commentators saying, remarking that you cannot leave the Muslims behind in the hands of colonialism. That is a very niche concern. For the mainstream concern was the loss of those natural resources. So, and also there's many slippages in this discourse of friendship between Christian and Muslim Filipinos that the Christian elite try to put forward. And you can see that in the case of Muslim sailors who appeared off the coasts of Luzon and Visayas in these contexts, because much of the way these were covered in the press indicates that they actually suspected that they were coming with violent intentions, right? So they would say things like, oh, the Muslim sailors, they were peaceful and they traded without committing any acts of violence, which of course signals that the expected acts would be the opposite, that they would be violent. Now, so next slide. And this is the crux of the economic discussion going on here. Which is, I can't really get into all that detail in this presentation because of time, but rubber became this huge element in this context. There was basically a functional British monopoly in the time period. They were raising prices, so there was a sudden impulse, American impulse, metropolitan impulse, to find a place where they could get rubber under their own flag. And Mindanao and Palawan, Mindanao, the Sulu archipelago, and Palawan become the places where rubber can be grown under like different scientific studies of the time, right? Because Luzon and Visayas were too beset by typhoons and such. So, but Mindanao seemed to replicate the conditions of like Sumatra or of Malaya, and thus it could be. Now, all of this is about the potential natural resources of Mindanao, and you see this very ambivalent approach to the situation, this concern about like what's going to happen if the Philippines becomes a major rubber producer. And you can see that in this cartoon, kung madikit kaya ng goma ay matanggal pa, and it's this whole concern. You can see this concern about like, hey, so like if you have goma, rubber, which also used to mean in Tagalog glue, which is a borrowing from Spanish, and you can see them like gluing the United States to the Philippines, right? And there's this concern that should this happen, the Philippines would become a permanent colony of the United States, either the entire Philippines, or that they would like try to partition off the southern part, which is precisely where the cleavage exists, right? Like the Muslim population that they claim to be separate. Now, all of this came to a head in the Bacon Bill of 1926 when a US congressman proposed to partition the Philippines, right? It was this outright bill. And for many Christian Filipinos, this was the proof that this is what Wood has been moving towards this whole time. All of his moves, all of these, like promoting violence, suggesting that there's long-term animosity between both communities. All of these were parroted by Representative Robert Bacon, who was actually a childhood friend of Leonard Wood. So like the most perfect mouthpiece for this policy. There were major protests in Manila, all of which quickly it was interesting because the Bacon bill was very quickly dropped from the legislative agenda in the United States. So they didn't have to carry out other measures other than protests that they may have foreseen. But the entire debate about this, about what to do with this bill, led to, could show the cleavages within these elites, right? And you can see this cartoon, which is like, I really like the cartoon because it really is like a geobody, right? And you can see how Representative Bacon is chopping off, amputating, dismembering this geobody. I also find it interesting because precisely Mindanao is the legs, right? It is Luzon and Visayas can carry on existing, they could still be alive, but so Mindanao is kind of like the less necessary, you could still be alive without it, but it would like severely impact your the livelihood of this geobody. But yeah, so Mindanao is not the head, it's not the body, it's the legs, right? Anyway, so in this entire discussion that happened in this context, one could see how for the majority of this Christian elite, the land of Mindanao is it clearly belongs to the Philippines. The population of Mindanao, however, is a much more blurry sort of situation. They see the Muslim majority as this group that they both want to attract, but also they do constitute a threat. They constitute a threat of violence. They're still scared whenever, like when you see Muslim sailors outside of Mindanao, you're scared of the juramentado, you're scared of the possibility of unrest, and especially of the possibility of them being used as tools by Leonard Wood to break up the country. So the way to suture the country for this Christian elite is to flood Mindanao with Christian settlers from Luzon and Visayas. And that once you flooded the territory enough, then the possibility of talking about creating a separate Muslim homeland under US colonialism would become a moot. Another thing that I found interesting and that I can't really get into that much is how these different stakeholders were voiced in this context, and the Muslim elites were given a lot of voice, especially those who spoke in favor of common independence with Christian Filipinos, of the preservation of the geobody as it was understood by the Christian elite, and of remaining together as part of this of a future independent Philippines. They do give some space to those members of the Muslim elite who instead chose to support a partition. but who were roundly condemned. The voices of the Muslim, say just the more peasant class, the more lower class, they are not given a voice. And it's also interesting that the Christian populations who were already settling in the area, were already creating communities of settler colonists, were not given a voice. So it's mostly an elite thing. You hear the voices of these elite politicians, Christian Filipino politicians, and of these elite datus and sultans as well, which reflects the logic of the era. So anyway, so what I want to close with is that both the Christian elite, the Christian literate elite of Filipinos and American colonizers were keenly aware of that connecting Luzon and Visayas with Mindanao was still relatively new, relatively tentative, and this awareness gave rise to a lot of anxiety, a lot of rumors on the part of the Christian Filipino elite, and also the opportunity for certain sectors of American colonizers to see a wedge, to see a crack where they could drive a wedge to partition the country. And studying these bouts of Moro Unrest allows us to get insights into how these the prejudices and stereotypes of the time and how the discourse of national unity under American colonialism went through several stages and ambiguities that were always being constructed under colonialism. So yeah, thank you very much. I look forward to hearing comments and questions.
Thank you very much, Jorge. I think the audience is certainly going to agree that was a very thought-provoking session. So thank you very much for shining a light on the implications of the 1923 to 1926 events that surrounded the Moros and the Christian relationship at that time. So we'd like to invite, of course, our participants to put in questions in the Q&A. And it's wonderful to see some familiar names among the participants. So please, let's make this a lively discussion. I might kick things off while waiting for everyone to collect their thoughts and put in their questions. And start off with which I'm hoping to be a relatively easy question, Jorge. You mentioned that there was a specific focus on the tensions in the Lanao region. Is there a particular relevance as to why the tension seemed to be like concentrated in that area rather than, say, Palawan, for example?
So that's a good question. The Lanao region just seemed to have more coverage in the press at that moment, and it was the source of all these swirling rumors about like what is Governor-General Wood up to in this context. There were so many things that he was doing in that he cut the funding for this ship that they used to keep the area communicated and so on, and he would also not go to specifically the Lake Lanao area after violence erupted, when he presumably would want to go and like carry out fact-finding missions. I guess, I mean, a lot of my research is about how this is pictured in the minds of this Christian Filipino elite mostly in Manila. So like getting into the specifics of why, like Datu Santiago, for instance, is revolting is something that has escaped me thus far. I know that Jojo Abinales and Oliver Charbonneau have they generally argue that there is this general trend towards these datus needing to shore up support and trying to shore up their role within the community. and facing some kind of pressure from the colonial system, and then rising as leaders. And it's part of, I guess, a wider Southeast Asian trend towards the men of prowess. Now, as to like Palawan in particular, it's the Muslim population there is much smaller, and that is also interesting in as much as it was still included in this Muslim colony that Governor-General Wood hoped to create, which, if you're thinking about it in ethnographic terms, it would not make that much sense. But I swear I found this map of like the rubber producing areas of the areas of the Philippines with rubber producing potential. I've been looking for it in my photographs. I can't find it yet, but I'm sure it's out there. I swear I saw it, and it mapped out precisely on the territory foreseen by the Bacon Bill, including Palawan. So Palawan is an interesting territory in that respect.
Yeah, it's interesting, and I guess when you bring in other factors like the economic factors that you brought up, the issues on identity and all of that, I guess it does make for a complex scenario. So the questions are coming in thick and fast, Jorge. So I'm going to start off with Patricia de Fudo's question. Thank you for the interesting presentation. Were the Muslims really puppets of Wood? Were there specific sources like newspapers that advocated for a certain perspective? And what did private correspondence or Wood's diary entries say? This is a really interesting question. So over to you, Jorge.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I have not been able to ascertain that. Getting my hands on Wood's diary is precisely one of the things that was impeded by the pandemic. I'm hoping to go to DC relatively soon, and it's in the Library of Congress, the diary, if I'm not mistaken. But Patricia, if you should happen to know if they have like if it's been digitized and it's available somewhere, that would be like, I would be super grateful for that information.
Thanks, Jorge. And the other questions seem to focus on the Moro side or the Muslim side of the story. So I'm going to lead with those. From Rodrigo Valencia, did the Moros of Mindanao have a self-identity? Did they see their struggle in religious terms? Or did they see both the mainland Catholic Filipinos and American colonizers as the same Christian collective foe? Or was their concept of a greater or lesser evil? This is a really interesting question.
Yeah, for sure. I think so. Like even today, there are complicated relations within the Muslim communities of the Philippines itself. You have the Tausug, you have the Maguindanao, you have Ningan, you have the different groups of the Lanao region. So even now, when you have this whole idea of the Bangsamoro, a much more quote unquote more of like a 20th century nationalist sort of movement, it is still much. I mean, the completely united nation is a complete fiction, right? They all it is, but especially in this era, it was still much more fragmented. A lot of these were still smaller. In many cases, it's just a datu, right? It is the modern notions of nation were still percolating. So yeah, I mean, they have their own identities, but it's not necessarily a pan Moro identity as such. And thus you see in one of my slides, there was this cartoon of Governor-General Wood as this kind of vampire or aswang figure who was seeding discontent and conflict in the Philippines. And one of the permutations is Christians versus Moros, but there's also Moros versus Moros, right? So they are fighting amongst themselves as well. Now, so do they see the Americans and the Christian Filipinos as like the same thing, it does not seem that way. It seems that like in their calculations, for those who were against Philippine independence, their calculations were that Christian Filipinos in Manila or like led or governed from Manila are a bigger threat than the faraway American Christians. That they could bring in much larger numbers of settlers, that they're just like a bigger threat to their continued community and life and lifestyle. So they clearly preferred the idea of being partitioned away and staying under U.S. Sovereignty. Now, it is true that they're constantly trying to play against each other. There's a famous senator Haji Butu, and he has this fantastic issue with translation, and apparently he like meets with the American authorities and he tells them, yes, I support the Bacon Bill. I want the Moro territory to be a separate colony. I want it to be an American colony forever. And then in the same day, he also tells Filipino reporters, I am against the Bacon Bill. We should be a united country. And then that explodes onto the press, and it's like, okay, which one is the real Haji Butu, right? So there's a lot of trying to play both sides, of trying to tell both sides what they want to hear and try to get the best possible deal. But yeah, I guess by the 1920s, all of these things explode onto the press very quickly, and it becomes a much more difficult thing to handle.
Yeah, really, just a complex problem to untangle, Jorge. And so I thought I'd bring together Rodrigo's question and Patricia's question and ask you, based on the primary data that you've been able to access, how real was the conflict in the 1920s? Was the conflict really just the magic of puppetry, as Patricia has indicated, or was there a real sense of conflict between Christian and Filipino, Christian and Muslim identity? How real does it seem to you based on the primary data?
I would say that culturally, it was still very much ingrained in both communities that there is a conflict, an underlying conflict, and I think I would argue that all of these protestations of saying, no, we are a united nation, we love each other so much, is protesting too much, right? It is like you only need to really say that when it's not entirely true. And you see this in the cases of these Moro sailors, right, who go outside like the usual the usual coasts of Mindanao, and they show up in Visayas, they show up in Luzon, and you see all the newspaper coverage of people being surprised by how peaceful they are. So, and of being like wary of them and being peaceful. There's also this fantastic case in which a group of Moros lands in Palawan and murders a former representative or something, and then there's this whole thing in the press, and the representative for Palawan says we should create a constabulary navy that keeps Moros away from Palawan and the rest of the Philippines. We should box them into Mindanao where they belong. And everybody's like, yeah, you can't really do that. That's kind of illegal. I mean, you can't really argue that we are all Filipinos and then restrict the freedom of travel to part of the country. But you can see these kinds of immediate responses, right? Because you never see, or maybe there is, I don't know, like a Bicolano murdering a Tagalog and then saying like, okay, we should probably just restrict Bicolanos to Bicol, right? I don't think that is much of a thing. But with the case of the Moros, there's this clear othering. There's this sensation of like, there's going to be conflict. The fascinating thing about that case with the murder was that the murderers were not Muslims. They actually turned out to be Christians disguised wearing Muslim garb just to And what I find also fascinating is that the newspapers say like, oh, they were actually, quote, Christian. And they put quotation marks about them being Christian Filipinos, kind of like suggesting like, okay, well, you know, like they're violent. So like, how Christian really are they? But when they talk about Moro Juramentados, they never say like Muslim Filipino. They just say Muslim Filipino runs amok, right? So, and you can, yeah. So at least there is a cultural baseline of this mutual tension and suspicion. I think James Warren says that even today, and his today being the 1980s, that people get nervous on the coast when they see unidentified like sailing ships, right? As a memory of the long history of raiding and so on. So culturally, I would say yes. Now, another thing that I wanted to look at before the pandemic hit was like, okay, the Filipinos insist that there were large amount of violence in the early years, then it drops during Filipinization, and they provide numbers, they provide statistics, and then it goes back up with Leonard Wood. One thing I wanted to look at was, okay, are these numbers true or not, or is this propaganda? So that is also something that I would love to look at in more detail in the future.
As always, research like this raises more questions than answers. So this is I think shaping up to be a really great research agenda for you, Jorge. So just building on the point that there were very clear underlying cultural tensions, and you mentioned that there was a very clear othering between Christians and Moros. If we unpack that a little bit more and kind of look closer into both, you know, collectives, so the Christian group versus the Moro group, Dakila Yi has a really interesting question. Can you share how the elites were divided or may have been divided on the idea of the Moro population? So in other words, how homogeneous was the thinking among the Christian elites versus in terms of the civilizing mission or internal settler colonization? Were there internal differences in the Christian Filipino elite perspective? Thank you for that question, Dakila.
Generally, I would say that it is almost monolithic, this idea that they were civilizing the Muslims. And it is, of course, one of these, I think that, so my full dissertation was a comparative between the Philippines and Peru, and what is happening with tracts of the Amazon rainforest, and then we're also under territorial dispute that were being disputed with neighboring countries. And one thing that I see in the 1920s is that there is this very strong impulse to try to talk about themselves as brothers, as the Muslim Filipino. Like they try to, sometimes they're even trying to avoid the use of Moro, of Mohammedan. They're trying to transition towards Muslim Filipino. You do still see those other words, but when I looked at documents from like the very early 20th century, much of it was like Moros or Moritos, which is the diminutive in Spanish, and it's kind of derogatory, and so on. And I remember this statement by a lawyer from 1905 in which he said, like, I think he was asked by a committee, like, what will happen with the Moros of Mindanao if we Americans withdraw tomorrow? And he said, like, oh, well, we will create an army and a navy and we will go conquer them. So you see that in like the very early 20th century. By the 1920s, you see a transition towards this like more civilizing mission, that we are willing to make great sacrifices for the Moros. We're spending a lot of money in building schools and roads in Moro land. So that puts us, it is also a mechanism of speaking towards the colonizer, right? Which is something that the Peruvians didn't need to do. The Peruvians like hardly ever talk about being brothers with the Amazonian indigenous peoples. So you see a difference there. And it is possible that if I hypothesize, and this is of course, alternative history and so on, like that if the Malolos Republic had gained independence, their politics towards the Lumad and towards the Moros would have been similar to that of the Spanish American republics, right? Of just going in there and conquering them. So mostly monolithic. There were, however, very few exceptions that I found fascinating, of one politician saying like, hey, we are in a time post World War I. Well, I mean, they don't call it World War I, of course. It would be very depressing calling it World War I at the time. They say like, yeah, we're in the age of self-determination. Maybe we should give the Muslims self-determination as well. Maybe because much of the American press pushed that rhetoric as well. Like, oh, you Christian Filipinos complain about us not giving you free determination, self-determination. Why don't you want to give the Moros self-determination? Most of them rejected that rhetoric because they're like, no, we're brothers. So like they have their own self-determination. We together have self-determination, but you do see very few people saying like, maybe we should give them self-determination. So mostly monolithic with a few exceptions.
The monolithic character of this thinking is supremely interesting to me from a psychological lens as well as a sociological lens. Like how did we get there? How did we get so how did they get to be so monolithic? Thank you for that. And so the remaining questions that we have from the audience are mainly focused on the impact, which is, I think, a great way to end this fascinating session. So the impact of the conflict from of the 1920s. So I'll start off with Christian's question. How did the plans of colonizing Mindanao in the 1910s affect American and Filipino legislators, specifically during the 1920s, the immediately the subsequent decade? Thank you for that question, Christian.
What I see what I've seen in my research is there's this constant call for more colonization, for more settler colonialism by Christian Filipinos to Mindanao. There is, the rhetoric of the land of promise is already there. There's all these cartoons about like satirizing poor Christian Filipinos, landless Christian Filipinos in the north who could just go to the south and just find lots of land. It is this rhetoric of like, there's empty land, you can just go and like be rich, and so on. Now, you do see, I constantly see all these op-eds year after year saying like, we have to take the colonization of Mindanao seriously. We have to start it. We have to do it. Which suggests like the more they talk about we should do this, suggests that it is definitely not happening to the degree that they hope would be happening, right? But it's definitely happening. There's all this talk in the press. There's many other small bouts of unrest, and the targets are often Christian Filipinos who have settled there, who have arrived there, and there's even this concern that all of this violence that was rumored to have been incited by Leonard Wood would have several. It creates this sensation of ungovernability, of Christian failure, incompetence, but also there was all this talk about like Christian settlers who were already there, seeing all this violence and mulling, well, maybe I should just go back to Luzon. Maybe I should just go back to Visayas because things here are getting out of control, which is also another thing that Wood can take advantage of, because the fewer Christians that are left, the more he can push this rhetoric of like, okay, this is a Muslim territory that we can break away. So from what I see, there's all these calls for like, we have to make a new migration law. We have to like, as legislators, we need to promote this. We need to promote this more.
While there's been clear impact on the legislation and, of course, the politics following the conflict. We've got another question that specifically focuses on attitudes to faith and different faiths. So do you think that by intervening, through its intervention in this struggle, did the Americans have a part in the long-standing division of Filipino people in terms of attitude to different faiths, groups of faith, despite having a common and shared historical struggle?
The memory of American colonization is such a complicated thing. The erasure of the Philippine-American War and the Moro American War is also like this. The erasure and memory of them is such a something I find fascinating. In his book, Michael Hawkins, Making Moros, he comments on, like, I think it's in the intro in which he comments how like he went to do field work in the southern Philippines, and how being an American, many Moros that he would encounter, many Muslim Filipinos, he would encounter in the South, would tell them how much they loved America and how much they loved American colonization. So I found that fascinating, because at the same time you've got the massacres at Budaho and Budbaksak. You've got the extremely just an incredibly bloody war that also kind of gets erased, but also comes back to the fore in this context of like the quote unquote war on terror, which is this incredibly complicated thing as well. Now, to what degree has American colonization strengthened or diffused these conflicts between the faiths in the longer term of Philippine history? That's a complicated question that I'm not sure if I could give a definitive answer to. As I was saying, like I kind of hypothesized that the Malolos Republic would have gone very violent against the South, like would have tried to. Would they have been as effective as the Americans? Possibly not. Like they just have fewer resources at their command. So it is. Would they then have compromised more? That is also an interesting hypothetical, right? Like, I think someone like Leonard Wood would like to think that he had a long-lasting effect of keeping both communities apart. Would Muslim separatism have existed under the Malolos Republic? I would hypothesize it still would have. I am not sure. I think the Malolos Republic sent delegates to the South, and they were just like chased away because they were like, this is not my. The Sultan of Jolo of Sulu mentioned, like, when he found out that he had been handed over due to the Treaty of Paris, he was like, how can I was never colonized by the Spanish, and like, how can they? So he did not really. This construction of Muslim Christian fraternity is something you see it's constantly being built in circumstances such as this one. So yeah, it's complicated.
Yeah, it is. It's quite complex. But if there's one major takeaway that I'm going to walk away with from your session, Jorge, is that whatever it is, the events in between 1923 and 1926 do have, I think, long-lasting impacts on the Philippines in terms of legislation, in terms of politics, in terms of attitudes to faith, in terms of migration, as you mentioned earlier. So I might end with a question from Aris. Thanks for the fascinating talk, Jorge. This resonates with the migration waves of Christians to Mindanao, but most of us thought that this is only during the Marcos regime, so it's a relatively new phenomenon. So would you be able to extend the narrative beyond 1926? What happened during the early post-war period in terms of policies of the newly independent republic? And were there other proposals on how to deal with a Moro Geobody? And just to throw in one last thing, what echoes do we see of that today?
Okay, yeah, going back to like these waves of migration that Aries references to, make references and how like the longer term situation. Yeah, I do wonder to what degree Christian migration to Mindanao during the American colonial period was triggered by these anxieties of the Americans threatening to partition the country, because every time there's one of these incidents of like a possibility of the country being partitioned, you see all of these op-eds saying send more people to Mindanao, not just because it's rich, not just because there's a lot of empty land, which is of course one of those settler colonial facts, right? That there is such a thing as empty land, right? But they say like there's lots of natural resources, there's lots of empty land, and we need Christians there to, bind Mindanao to the United States. If they had not had that looming threat of partition, it is possible that migration would have been smaller. How much smaller is difficult to quantify. And after independence, it just becomes the floodgates are open, right? I do know that in the 30s, I want to say 35, there is a letter by a group of Muslim datus requesting to be for Mindanao to be partitioned away from the Philippines and annexed directly to the United States, kind of Hawaii style, I guess. But after that, I do not really recall other instances initiated within the American colonial context. In person, like Dr. Ricardo Jose, who like focuses on like a lot of the Japanese context, he does say he did tell me that he found documents that suggest that the Japanese were also considering partitioning away Mindanao from the Third Republic of the Philippines, which I find very interesting, because then you would see like this pan-imperial or like consecutive imperial logic of like, okay, like it's like what makes the Philippines? Christianity broadly, and like this is part of Mindanao that can be partitioned away and possibly annexed to the area that was under naval administration, right? Because you had one army, I forget the number of the army, was running Malaya and Sumatra, and you had another army running Java, and then the rest was run by the Imperial Japanese Navy. And you could see this scenario of the Sulu archipelago and Mindanao being attached to that body during, like, in a hypothetical post-war period with a Japanese victory. But eventually that did not come to pass. But yeah, I would unfortunately, I do not read Japanese. I am half Japanese myself, but I do not read the language. But that would be a fascinating topic of study, like how the Japanese also kind of like jumped on the bandwagon of like, let's partition the Philippines with following these ethnographic logics. I do wonder if they were interested in rubber as well or not.
Well, we should totally add Japanese to your portfolio of languages, Jorge. So maybe next time we meet, I hope that you would have acquired a new language then. So I'm loath to call this to call an end to the talk. Jorge, it's been such a fascinating morning for me and for everyone in the audience. Thank you so much for giving us such rich insights into the brief historical period in the Philippines that surprisingly still sends ripples through time that we continue to feel today. Thank you very much for sharing your expertise, your insights, and your thoughts. And thank you to the audience for sharing your time with us today. And we look forward to seeing you at our next SEAC PhilS4 session. Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Maraming salamat.